Children with disorganized attachment show multiple, contradictory attachment behaviors, both deactivating and hyperactivating. They have more dissociative experiences and behaviors than other children, and are often in states of unmitigated high fear arousal, and overall show significantly greater negative emotional arousal than children with other attachment prototypes. They have a poor capacity for affect regulation, which contributes to their chronic negative affect states. Observation of their play behavior reveals marked inhibition of playful exploration, as well as frightening, explosively angry, and helpless states. In part because of inhibited exploratory behavior, self-development is markedly impaired. So it took me a long time to actually understand and admit that while I had learned about disorganized attachment and thought it was like, your classic person who has borderline, which it very much can be, it's also taken me, a while to understand through my self-impatience that I myself also have wide swings of anxiety and avoidance. And I don't have borderline, but I definitely have relational patterns that say to me, people will abandon you and they're not safe, don't trust them, to people are stressful and the only way to feel totally calm is to be alone. I made a TikTok about this last week, and this is really what it looks like. I am someone who has a more disorganized style, and I see it for this reason. That in my childhood, both of my parents were at times loving, but really at the core emotionally neglectful, emotionally dangerous, and unsafe, because they both had significant patterns of attachment, lack of security, because they would be angry and rageful and very, eggshell type. They could both be set off out of nowhere. Because of my mother's own diagnosis, I believe, her own parentification and enmeshment with me. And all of that taught me that I needed to be prepared and on guard at all times. Now, the flip side to that is that the way that I managed myself was I would go into my room alone, or I would hear her coming home. So I would do my chores and then go be playing with Barbies or whatever, homework, listening to music. I spent so much of my childhood physically alone because my mom was gone. I was a latchkey child and raised by one working parent. And or I chose to be alone. And what has happened is I can have these wide swings. And this is what I see so often with disorganized attachment, is that on the one hand, we had this experience of living in hypervigilance. Like, we are always scanning. That has never left us. And so we're always reading everybody and over-interpreting. And then the flip side to that is that we only feel like, oh my God, I can feel safe now. I can turn that hypervigilance off when we are alone. And that is the topic of today's video, how for many people who have this style, they have these wide swings between anxious and avoidant behavior, and hopefully some suggestions and ideas about what you can do about it to begin to work on it. As a quick reminder though, let's talk about what kind of defines disorganized attachment. Now, for this one, the idea is that the source of safety, the attachment, was also the source of fear. So the very person you were supposed to go to for security was also the person you might want to be afraid of or running from or hiding from or, repeatedly shaped and wounded by in some circumstance. And so, as I always say, you've heard me say if you've watched my videos that, and this isn't my thought, this is what the research says, but that kids will choose the attachment. We have to find a way to get our bare minimum needs met. And if that means enduring abuse or wounding, so be it. A child cannot go out and provide for their own emotional and physical needs, under a certain age. And so the caregivers here, often the research shows that on the clinical end, we do see parents with disorders like borderline, unresolved trauma, emotional, dysregulation, bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, where alcoholism or substance abuse, right? These are wide degrees of engagement where the parent can't really settle and be safe. And so we see a lot of caregivers who are frightening and frightened. We see caregivers who dissociate, who rage, who are aggressive, who, what they say in the research, loom large in the child's face, right? Getting in their face, like, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing that? Or maybe they're doing it to the partner in front of you. These parents were constantly having their emotions, much like an anxious attachment, spill over into the child's world. And I would argue so much so that your wiring becomes, where is mommy, daddy, parent? What is happening with them? And I don't need to look at my own feelings first. I'm always looking at the parent to determine what is the temperature in the room right now, the house, the car, whatever. And that becomes what we call, or what Dan Brown calls, the outside-in orientation. We go about our lives always looking first to the outside to then determine the inside. And in the process, we neglect our own needs and don't even often know what they are, our own feelings. And also it helps us numb and not feel what we might feel if we let ourselves feel it, if that makes sense, right? So it's a great distraction, but at the core, this hypervigilance was a safety tool. And so kids are faced with this constant dilemma. We're often really, kids who really struggled to have our needs met consistently. It's like it is like walking on eggshells. It's like, I don't know what to expect. So I'm always going to be expecting that there will be eggshells. And so the problem is that this plays out in every relationship in our lives, from certainly our intimate ones the most, but in even our work environments or parenting, we are always scanning, and yet our nervous systems are often chronically ill, fatigued, depleted, and many of us will also need to isolate to be safe in our bodies and regulate. And so it's really a difficult place to be if you're not aware of it and trying to work on and manage kind of how you have these responses. But you want to look at them without shame or any kind of guilt and understand that this is what you had to do to survive. And you are probably never going to wake up and be completely healed. It's ridiculous to think that your entire childhood you were wired a certain way and you'll never feel that way again. What I believe can change over time is, of course, there is, as you hopefully live, although we often repeat these relationships, but let's say we're past that stage and we're working on it, and we learn to live in more calm states, we learn more self-regulation, we try to find healthier people, we don't necessarily make ourselves feel bad when we need to take care of our alone time, we give ourselves space to breathe, we give ourselves grace and compassion, or at least we try when we don't do any of these things well. And parenting obviously can be a huge trigger if you get triggered back to your own childhood with your own kids. But you own it, you say I'm sorry, you work on it, and you're not going to be perfect. And as I said, and I'll keep saying a million times, is you can learn to, I'm going off camera here, off frame, you learn to not live in it. You learn to not live in it. So let's talk about some things that you can do, because at the core, there's often a fear and this like isolation and loneliness and longing, like they're all kind of like intertwined in this big mess of a ball. And so let's talk about what you can do to help heal and recognize, heal meaning being in the healing process, to try to make your life and your attachment dynamics feel better for you. So what can you do? Number one is to separate and work on separating the blending of your hypervigilance and emotions from everyone else. What do I mean by that? I mean that because we are so used to taking on and holding the parent's state of mind and feelings and emotions, we often blend into everyone else's feelings, right? We don't have a good separation of self. So for example, like when my kids would get really upset, even now it's been even harder as they're adults and they're struggling, I tend to want to take that on, right? I feel it. I literally feel their moodiness if they're in the house or if they're down, or I swear if they're across the world, I still feel it. And I often flip it into being like, oh, of course they're struggling because I messed up this and that's their trauma. And yeah, maybe it is, but maybe it isn't. And so, or if they're in the house and let's say they're home visiting and they're just moody, it's like, I can take that personally and be like, really just feel that That is the historical conversation around being an empath, which I think, to be honest, is like really just us in training to manage these intense environments. But there really is a very thin barrier. And so between us and other people, we are often highly sensitive because we are living in that chronic scanning fight or flight state. And then we're interpreting and making meaning of it. And so basically I have to work on saying, okay, this is not you. This is, let's say, your partner, your child. These are their feelings. You're allowed to have feelings about that, but to work on separating yourself and not owning emotions that don't belong to you and then blaming yourself for them. So it's really, really important. Or to think you have to like fix them. People need to feel their feelings. And this is especially triggering in our partners and kids or close relationships where we just want to fix it. And we really don't know, we can't do that. So learning to separate and try to walk alongside and realize, is this me or is this them? And then do some work on yourself. Number 2, look at your tendencies in terms of everything around parentification and enmeshment and how that has impacted you. And so if you have a more disorganized attachment system, there's a very good chance that there was a lot of blending with your parent to you. Whether it was you acting in a functional role, running the house, a more emotional role, you being the parent's therapist or best friend. And so all of that often gets put, then flipped onto you. And so you become a perfectionist or never good enough, or you have a hard time respecting boundaries or setting boundaries. So I would say go back and look at some videos I've done on this issue, because it's really important to look at. If you have a more disorganized style, there's a very good chance that you do struggle with a lot of the issues that are really part of parentification and enmeshment. Number 3, examine your compulsive caregiving. So that's the outside in orientation, you being a caretaker, which you pretty much have to do to that kind of fawning behavior at times to also survive in really eggshell type homes. And so on the one hand, you just want to like focus on everybody else. But the flip side of that is you also are conflict averse. You don't deal with conflict. And so you avoid it, you shut it down, it feels really scary, but maybe then you take too much and you blow. And so you really want to look at how much do you say yes as a caregiver and then maybe like feel resentful and blow later. Or how often do you just keep saying yes to the point where you're just like physically unwell because you avoid conflict, because to you, actually speaking up for yourself feels like conflict. So a lot of us have danger around anger, and that's a whole other concept, but it's really important to look at how do you deal with anger, conflict, and self-advocacy. Number 4, work on managing your anxiety in your body. So this is all of the polyvagal theory stuff, the nervous system regulation, breathing, mindfulness, cardio, guided meditations, all the things to do, pausing literally in the moment, slowing down and breathing. So yoga, all of that stuff, those are important. Number 5, work on recognizing when you are shutting down and numbing. This is very, very common. We use addictions, we use shopping, we use distractions, we use binge watching, whatever it is, because we are needing to shut down. And like I said in the beginning, that's okay, we might need to, but try to pay attention to when you're using it as it is always your go-to. And you just feel flooded, so you shut down and isolate. Flooded, shut down, isolate. To the point where it is keeping you from experiences, connections, relationships, things like that. And for example, let's say if you're a parent and you are doing this and you are literally like, if you need a break from your child, that is important. But if you are repeatedly staying in your bed all day or you're numbing out, and that is the heart of attachment, right? Parents and child need to have a reciprocal, generally warm relationship. So just because you're popping in a meal for them or putting the TV on, we all go through stages of struggle and depression, things like that. But that is the sign for you to get help, because that will have an impact, of course, on you. And even more so, which you obviously don't want, is to kind of carry on that generational trauma. So it's like having grace and knowing that you won't be perfect, but also not being afraid to say, you know what, I need help. I can't do this. And I know getting help isn't easy either. That is also a whole other video, but just pay attention to how often you're doing that. And when it's like, okay, I need this, and when it starts to become really disruptive to your life and relationships. The next one is look at your strong tendencies to repeat these relationships. And here's the thing. Especially if you had what I would call an extremely dysregulated, emotionally difficult, relationally difficult parent who might fit the criteria of borderline, who might be narcissistic with rage or, just controlling behaviors, or emotionally toxic, emotionally unsafe. Especially if they were really emotionally dysregulated. It's very common for actually even people who have more borderline disorders to be attracted initially to people who have narcissistic traits. Because in comparison, the narcissist will present as, I'm not dysregulated, I'm confident, I've got it together, I can manage you, I can hold things, I'm safe. And that is where we can often repeat the pattern. So if you had what I have described as what you think might be a parent with strong borderline traits, be really aware if you can, and take your time in the mating and dating and having babies process if you can. I didn't know this when I did all this, and so I had to learn the hard way much, much later down the road. But I wish I'd really understood that I was like primed to see certain qualities as, oh, this will feel secure and safe, when really all it was narcissism hidden in a different attachment pattern that was actually more avoidant. And the avoidant felt safer than the chaotic, anxious part of the borderline parent type. So remember that too. You might be drawn to what feels like, oh, this person is never going to be emotionally chaotic. Oh God, that feels so much better. But then you wake up one day and they have like no emotional connection to anyone, let alone themselves or you or your kids. The next one is to look at, honor the confusion around your needs for wanting to be dependent and taking care of somebody, and the reality of what that has felt like. And so the truth is that we often long to be finally safe and secure and cared for, like I was saying in the last part, and that we confuse, attachment security with trying to find a way to have, a safer dependence. And that actually there's a difference between dependence and attachment bonding. And so in the research we talk about dependence is like, I depend on you to give me food and maybe a place to sleep. But attachment bonding is about so much more. It's about how you engage with me, how you regulate your emotions, how you respond to my caregiving needs, right? How you deal with your feelings. So pay attention to how all of that can show up, not just in you and how you show up in the world and other relationships, but how you choose people and how you respond and things like that. Number 8, stop and explore the nature of your current parent relationship you have right now. And so I discuss this a lot in my course. It's like, you can do all the therapy in the world, but if you are not, let's say if you have more wounded parents, but if you are not dealing with your wounded parents in some way, whether it's setting boundaries and that's going well, or having a more tea party relationship and that's going okay, it's not great, but it's better than fighting or feeling bad, or if it doesn't work out completely, you've tried everything and going no contact, if you don't deal with the heart of those wounds, that is where the wound began. And you're still in the same child role with your parents who are still not, safe emotionally. It is really hard to make progress in any form of healing. So that's really important. And also to not watch it play out in your future relationships. And lastly, to work on 2 more things, which is your balance, because with this type of childhood, we tend to split ourselves, much like in borderline and narcissism, where it's like everything is all good or all bad, it's all black or all white. We do that to ourselves. So we're all good or all bad, right? We're perfect or imperfect, or never perfect, if let's be honest, but like we want to be. But the bottom line is that we don't know how to live in the gray area. And so much of life is this gray area. And so learning how to just like, before you have a quick reaction or a quick response, to learn to pause, to take a breath, to try to not respond, to say, mommy needs a minute, give me just a minute. And maybe you walk down the hall and you take a few breaths, or daddy or parent, whoever you are, to learn that, we want to just like in our mind, we also need our brain to just like categorize things. But life is really, and so much of it is not, it doesn't work like that. But in your childhood, you were making those those split moment decisions, good, bad, right, wrong, safe, unsafe. And that's important too. But if you live in that, you're sort of reenacting your trauma all of the time. So part of it is like creating a new parenting world for yourself. And you slow down. And as I also say in my other parenting course really quickly, is that you have to do things. You have to set up your life that says, I'm a person that believes I have value. And that is how I will work on boundaries or nourish my body. It's not just about saying I should love myself more. That just doesn't work. I'm sorry, that alone does not work. And then lastly, look at your own dissociation tendencies, because for so many of us, our parents were dissociated, and they often would, if they're raging at you and dissociating from their own childhood and mad at you about something stupid, but they're yelling at you and saying it's your fault, for example, oftentimes they're reacting to a trigger in their own dissociation of their own childhood, but they're projecting and putting all of that on you. And so what's happening though when they're doing that is they cannot attune to you. It's like they're there, but they're not really there. And you can do the same thing, because oftentimes we have to dissociate, and we spend hours in maladaptive daydreaming or fantasies about how, I used to say I would go on, road trips, and I would just like spend hours of the road trip looking out the window, fantasizing about my adult life. And, I think part of that is fine, because like I wanted to plan for my adult life, but it also didn't necessarily go the way I wanted. And part of that was a coping mechanism to deal with where I was going and what was happening. But that can become a really large go-to, whether we binge watch for, days on end, or spend too much time in fantasy creating worlds. A part of that is just fine and okay. But if that is your only mechanism, or if you tend to start, getting mad at your own kids or your partner by dissociating, and you're like realizing later, like, I don't even know what I said, or what was I mad about, and you can't work on calming your body and owning your behavior and making repairs and trying to shift and change, once again, you are reenacting your own disorganized attachment trauma, and it is really hard to make shifts because you just feel bad all the time, right? You feel bad physically, you feel triggered, you feel shame, whatever it is. And so those are really important. The last thing I'll say is that in this childhood, if you had one like this, and it might be on a wide spectrum, from emotional to, other forms of wounding, all the way on every level, the important thing is that you survived it. You survived it. And I know that these things are not easy to repair. It is really a day by day, year by year, moment by moment dynamic sometimes. Like, it feels like it took me years to recover from certain things. But I can look back now and say, like, I don't feel that way anymore. I can feel familiar to that feeling, but I don't hold myself accountable to that anymore. I'm okay with the decision I made here or there. It doesn't hurt so much. Or I can grieve that fantasy and let go. Like, whatever it is, it's really important to say, you're doing your best. You survived it, and you will continue to survive it. But to have grace and self-love in the terms of, like, how would a loving parent, hold you in your mind, visually or in an imaginary way, and say, it's okay, you're loved and you're lovable and you're not perfect, and I love you anyway. Because honestly, you will only be the only person that you really have in your mind and your heart, and who knows your own life inside out. You are the only person that will ever truly know what it is like to be you. And if you, can find little ways to say, I did the best I could, and I'm doing that now, and I can give myself grace, and I can also hold myself accountable to try to make some changes. That is how we grow and change over time. You're not going to wake up one day and be like, oh, well, I just loved myself today and now I'm fine. It just doesn't work like that. But you can find this love for yourself, this acceptance, this sort of like embracing of yourself in ways that you never had before, when you start to really own and understand the impact on your life and your story and your body in these types of experiences. Because it really is, the attachment experience, I truly believe, is the profound baseline for the rest of our lives. It really is, to me, the internal map. And we are the only ones that can truly shift it, along with other people. That is the core of attachment. That, in connection to others and ourselves, that is how we grow and heal and change. So, thank you for watching. Please stay safe and well, and I'll see you soon. Bye. Oh, did I forget to show you Coco? Hold on a second. Oh, she's napping. She's so sleepy. Look at Coco. Can you say bye? Bye. She's so asleep right now. Say bye. She's moochy.